Welcome everyone to our third seminar of the term. It gives me a great pleasure to see so many friends of the Latin American Center today with us, our own students from our master's programs. I welcome our former students as well, and from Oxford and beyond. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And welcome to our seminar. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Anna Cant. She's an assistant professor of Latin American history at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her research centers on rural development and political communication in the Andean region during the 20th century. She gained her PhD in history at the University of Cambridge in 2015 with a thesis on land reform in Peru, the topic of her seminar today. She's also doing fascinating work on radio education and ideas of rural modernity in Colombia during the 60s and 70s. And she's currently developing this research into a broader project on Catholic radio in the Andes. And I certainly hope that she will present her current research in future occasions in our seminar. Today, she will focus on her first book, Land Without Masters, Agrarian Reform and Political Change under Peru's Military Government, and that will be published by the University of Texas Press soon. So look forward to listening to Anna. Anna, very welcome to our seminar, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to Eduardo for the invitation to participate in this seminar. It's a really exciting opportunity for me, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to kick off my presentation here. So today I'm going to be talking about my first book, as Eduardo mentioned, which comes out in April this year with University of Texas Press. And I thought, rather than summarize the individual chapters, I'd like to take you through the central arguments of the book, and then perhaps in the Q&A I can kind of flesh out a bit more about my methodology and the detail of some of the chapters. But first, a few general comments about the political significance of land reform in Latin America and the particular characteristics of the Peruvian case. So I'm aware that many of you may be quite familiar with issues of land reform in Latin America. So I won't go into too much detail here. You're of course welcome to follow up on this in the Q&A. So thinking about land reform in Latin America in the 20th century, the basic problem across the region was that large quantities of land were held by large estates or latifundios, while the majority of peasants had either no land at all or a very small amount which they used for subsistence. From an economic point of view, this inequality restricted the size of the internal market and led to inefficient land use. But at a more profound political and social level, the dominance of the landowning elites meant that power was concentrated in the hands of the few. Peasants employed by these landowners were vulnerable to exploitation and semi-servile labor conditions, while large landowners, on the other hand, benefited from access to the highest echelons of government and huge influence across multiple sectors of the economy. So landowners often also had interests in the newspapers or in large industrial factories. In that respect, land ownership was viewed as the principal question of wealth distribution and political rights in Latin America. Land reforms of various kinds emerged over the course of the 20th century and were particularly prevalent in Latin America during the 1960s and 70s. These ranged from large-scale land redistribution, as in the case of Peru and Bolivia, to more limited technical assistance and the distribution of small quantities of state-owned land, as in Colombia. But what were the specific characteristics of the Peruvian process, and why is it being referred to as the peculiar revolution? Well, the Peruvian agrarian reform is unusual because it was introduced by a left-wing military government at a time when right-wing dictatorships were on march across the region. The chief of the Peruvian armed forces, Juan Velasco Alvarado, seized power in a military coup in 1968. A man of humble origins, Velasco had a personal commitment to the importance of agrarian reform and had little confidence that a civilian government could bring about the radical change that was required. And it's worth mentioning that already in 1964, a civilian government had tried to introduce land reform, but it was very marginal in its impact. The agrarian reform of 1969 was brought about through a legal decree, so it was enforced by the military government and redistributed around 45% of Peru's agricultural land from large landowners to newly created peasant cooperatives. And cooperatives were a really popular idea at the time as kind of a way both of managing land from an economic point of view, but also as the kind of basis for a new, more harmonious society. More than 50 years after it was introduced, the agrarian reform remains one of the most controversial issues in Peru's modern history. While right-wing commentators characterize it as a revolution that unjustly expropriated land and ruined the economy, others emphasize that it brought an end to the semi-feudal system of economic exploitation in the countryside. Peru's agrarian reform was subject to a great deal of debate and scholarship at the time, but this declined steadily in the 1990s, and it is only relatively recently that historians in particular have begun to reassess its long-term legacies and significance. So that's the kind of context in which I began my research. So I'd like to move on now to discuss the key arguments of my book. So firstly, the state interventions and the discourse that surrounded the agrarian reform, I argue, were almost, if not more, impactful than the transfer of land itself. Yeah. This was not a neutral process overseen by technocrats in distant government offices, but one that was actively promoted through state interventions in local politics, education, and mass communication. And those are the three key chapters in my book that where I draw out this argument. Across the country, peasants were encouraged to imagine a more socially just world in which their life chances would not be constrained by the will of the landowner. In a propaganda effort that was unprecedented in Peru's history, the Velasco government hired hundreds of artists, intellectuals, and promoters to articulate its reform agenda. And it's worth noting that, of course, land reform had been a kind of a wish and a desire of many people in Peru for decades prior to the Velasco government. And so the government was often quite successful in co-opting people into their own propaganda efforts because there was this kind of already activism and interest in promoting agrarian reform. This campaign has been touched on by others, but never treated as an important story in its own right. I studied the dynamics of this campaign at local, regional, and national levels, showing how it opened up new political debates that in turn transformed Peru's political culture. So, for example, this is one of the first posters that was produced to promote the agrarian reform, designed by a well-known artist called Jesus Ruiz Durand. And the slogan is 24th of June, Day of the Campesino, and this is the day that the agrarian reform was first introduced. The speech bubble reads, "We are free, the revolution is giving us the land." And what's striking, I think, is how the ideas of land and political freedom are linked here, and how the agrarian reform is presented as a central plank of the so-called Peruvian Revolution. So it's worth remembering that already by this point, JFK and the Alliance for Progress had promoted agrarian reform as a kind of positive step towards modernization. But the spin that the Velasco government give to the agrarian reform is a much more radical line about empowering the peasantry and creating a more inclusive, equal society. A key vehicle for the campaign was an organization created in 1971 called Sinamos. This stands for National System of Support for Social Mobilization, but the acronym also sounds like the words Sin Amos, or without masters. Sinamos operated at local, regional, and national levels, and although Velasco rejected the idea of a party of government, Sinamos promoters and officials ended up working in extremely partisan ways. I interviewed a number of people who work for Sinamos, and what I find interesting is the esprit de corps that was created inside the organization, particularly among young and recent graduates who had this kind of mission to serve the country and therefore ended up in a kind of strange alliance with otherwise authoritarian military officials. So this is a page from a Sinamos internal magazine. It features the director of Sinamos, and the text reads, "Our work is risky, tense, difficult. It is the work of those that fight on the front line of the revolution." So it was the job of Sinamos employees to inform peasants about the agrarian reform, support them in cases of expropriation and adjudication, and provide education and training for the newly established agricultural cooperatives. They were met by opposition from both the conservative right, who resisted the agrarian reform as an attack on property rights, and the radical left, who opposed reformism as a break on more revolutionary change. These struggles on the ground had a profound political impact. In the 1960s, Peruvian politics was still dominated by a small, mostly white elite in the capital, Lima. The vast majority of the peasant population was denied the votes on the grounds of illiteracy. The agrarian reform shattered that status quo in two respects. Firstly, carrying out the processes of land expropriation and distribution required a massive extension of the state presence into rural areas. So rural areas became part of national politics to a new degree. Secondly, the Velasco government also politicized that presence by expressly stating that the agrarian reform authorities would intervene on behalf of peasants against the landowners, and by investing heavily in education and propaganda to mobilize rural populations in support of the reform. The result was a radicalization of rural politics as new movements emerged on the left and right to contest the government's narrative, and a decentering of Peruvian politics took place, becoming less focused on Lima and more inclusive of peasants as citizens. So this comic strip from a newspaper produced by the Independent Peruvian Peasant Confederation, or CCP, gives an idea of how that radicalization was experienced in practice. It depicts a campesino meeting organized by Sinamos. And we can see here on the top of the cartoon, the Sinamos functionary speaking a lot of blah, blah, blah. He tries to convince the campesinos to form an agrarian league, one of the new forms of political association established by the regime. But in the comic, the peasants respond, "There can only be union, harmony with those of your own class, poor with poor, rich with rich, long live the struggle." So this is the kind of conflict between the sort of corporatist, inclusive revolution the Velasco government is trying to promote, and the more traditional leftist argument that revolution can only come from the people and from the grassroots. And the source is interesting because we see the political confrontations that emerged at the local level. During the agrarian reform, there was a constant presence of government functionaries in the countryside, organising events, promoting new forms of association, and encouraging people to participate in the government's reforms. Once their presence was established in rural areas, Sinamos officials ended up taking on a range of roles that extended beyond their original remit of promoting the agrarian reform. For example, they maintained a book of complaints where people could denounce mistreatment or corruption on the part of government officials in other ministries or government agencies. They also helped foster political leaders among the younger generation of peasant cooperative members. And these individuals often went on to have a long-term presence in regional or national politics. Another significant state intervention surrounding the agrarian reform was education. This included the nationwide 1972 educational reform, which sought an overhaul of the education system to make it more inclusive, less elitist, and more centered on Peruvian history and culture, rather than emulating European or North American traditions. In addition, there was a mass literacy campaign and training courses for agricultural cooperatives. In terms of raising literacy and numeracy levels, these interventions were not terribly successful, but they represented another avenue through which the status quo could be challenged, and campesinos' entitlement to education and empowerment was clearly articulated. So to summarize, the agrarian reform was accompanied by state interventions in education, the media, and local politics. These interventions to a large extent altered the remit and presence of the state and put into circulation a series of ideas about campesino rights and identity that continued to reverberate long after the expropriation and adjudication of land, and indeed long after that land had then been bought up once again by multinational corporations. The second key argument I make in the book is that the agrarian reform was perceived differently in different parts of the country, and that the Velasco government became heavily invested in attending to regional politics while trying to roll out its national programme. So I used a regional comparative approach to examine the differences and similarities in how the agrarian reform is experienced in 3 regions of Peru: Piura in the far north, Cusco in the southern highlands, and Tacna on the southern coast on the border with Chile. I selected these regions because of their contrasting histories and socioeconomic makeup. By comparing such different regions, I was able to analyse both the ways in which different regional populations responded to the agrarian reform and the continuities or differences in the interactions between local, regional, and national layers of government. So what comes out is not just a series of case studies, but rather a sort of tendency in how the Velasco government approached agrarian reform as a kind of plank of nation building. So a brief outline of each region will help clarify the point. Piura is a coastal region dominated by large agro-industrial complexes producing exports such as cotton and sugar. Prior to the agrarian reform, the majority of peasants worked as temporary labourers on the large haciendas and were weakly organised politically. During the Velasco era, Piura became an important political base for the left-wing parties Vanguardia Revolucionaria and MIR. Piura's agriculture had been declining since the early 1960s, leading to a high degree of unemployment. This made Piura's peasants both highly responsive to the agrarian reform and a target for left-wing activism, since they were considered to hold strong revolutionary potential. Cusco in the southern highlands has a subtropical highland climate that is generally dry and temperate. The varied landscape makes it possible to produce a wide range of agricultural products. In contrast to the agro-industrial plantations in Piura, Cusco farming methods were more traditional and less intensive. Since the high altitudes and steep inclines did not permit the use of heavy machinery, the farming remained quite traditional. In the late 1960s, agricultural land continued to be highly concentrated in the hands of a small number of hacendados and religious orders. Whereas peasant mobilization in Piura developed rapidly and largely in response to the economic decline of the mid-20th century, in Cusco, there was already an established history of peasant unions and popular mobilization against exploitative landowners. The majority of peasants were indigenous Quechua speakers, and many belonged to communities that had been displaced from their ancestral lands through the expansion of the haciendas. In the 1940s, the Communist Party developed an important presence in the Cusco countryside via the Federation of Cusco Workers. With the arrival of peasant activist Hugo Blanco in the Valley of La Convención in 1958, the region gained a reputation as a communist stronghold. Tacna, on the southern coast, presents a further contrast in geography, patterns of land tenure, and political tradition. At the time of the agrarian reform, Tacna had a large number of small landowners and few latifundios of the kind found in northern Peru. Its chief agricultural products were alfalfa and other food crops, rather than international exports such as coffee, sugar, or cotton. Alongside agricultural production, Tacna's economy centered on mining, industry, and fishing, while its proximity to the border with Chile made it an area of intense commercial activity. Politically, Tacna was not a stronghold for any of the major parties. Unlike Piura and Cusco, which saw a growth of political activism during the agrarian reform, party politics remained a marginal activity in Tacna. The 50-year Chilean occupation of Tacna following the War of the Pacific deeply affected the history and identity of the region, forging a political discourse that was both nationalistic and defiantly independent. Unlike Cusco and Piura, which have been considered emblematic cases and received sustained academic attention, studies of the agrarian reform in Tacna are almost non-existent. Yet Tacna's agriculture also formed part of the Velasco government's vision for a new Peru, and it was also subject to sustained media, education, and political campaigns throughout the reform era. This makes it an interesting case to compare with Cusco and Piura, and one that helps highlight the agrarian reform's importance as an act of nation building. I first became interested in this idea of regional difference when I was studying the propaganda of the agrarian reform for my master's dissertation. I was struck by how the imagery and language used in the posters of the agrarian reform seemed to target particular regional populations and present the reform in ways that would be locally significant. So in Piura, the agricultural cooperatives were promoted as a means to embrace modernity and access a better quality of life. While in Cusco, the agrarian reform was framed as a continuation of the region's peasant struggles and a way of returning the land to its original indigenous owners. However, government officials were also forced to question the cultural assumptions that informed the regime's vision of Peru's region. And I think this is something that really came out in my doctoral research that I hadn't been able to study during my master's. At times, the military government's stereotyped view of particular regions meant that it communicated poorly with the population groups that it sought to inform and persuade. For example, the government's concept of northern Peru as the site of large agro-industrial complexes and the engine of modernity did not take account of the great internal diversity of a region such as Piura, the continued importance of communal identities, an idea the government associated almost exclusively with the Southern Highlands, nor the impact of migration flows between highland and coastal areas. Similarly, in Cusco, Sinamos officials assumed the strong communal traditions of the indigenous population and the history of peasant unions would lead to strong support for agricultural cooperatives. But the ideas of collectivized production embodied in the government's cooperative model often did not sit well with understandings of community and reciprocal labor in the highlands. In Tacna, Sinamos officials complained of a high degree of indifference among the population. They were also met with mistrust, and in some cases seen as a kind of secret police, an idea that had particular salience given what was going on just over the border in Chile under General Pinochet. So although the Peruvian agrarian reform is often seen as a revolution by decree, in reality, a series of negotiations took place on the ground, which shaped the outcomes of the agrarian reform at the local level. As well as enriching our understanding of the reform process in each of these regions, the book therefore tells a bigger story about the relationship between central government and the regions, how the idea of the region is consolidated and reshaped through state practice, and the challenges of establishing political hegemony in the context of great regional diversity, which I think is a theme in many areas of Latin America. The last point I'd like to talk about today is the collective memory of the agrarian reform. As I mentioned at the beginning, the agrarian reform holds a deeply contested position in Peru's collective memory. There are a variety of reasons for this. Partly it's due to the group identities that were forged at the time. For example, militants of Vanguardia Revolucionaria continue to see the agrarian reform as a bourgeois attack on authentic peasant association and activism, while former Sinamos employees remain loyal to the Velasco regime and what it was trying to achieve. The government propaganda used to promote the agrarian reform played an important part in the creation of these group identities. For example, the National Agrarian Confederation, which was created by the regime in 1974, remains active today and continues to define itself in relation to the agrarian reform using key ideas promoted by the regime: rejection of the oligarchy, liberation from servitude, and popular participation. The CNA organizes annual pilgrimages to visit Velasco's grave in Lima. And such events reinforce the organization's ties to the Velasco government and its political legacy. Yet collective memory and collective identity are never fixed. They remain responsive to changes in individuals' immediate circumstances and the wider social context. And in that respect, an important event or period of Peru's history in changing how the agrarian reform was seen is the internal armed conflict from 1980 until 2000, which had a big impact on perceptions of the agrarian reform. As many of you will know, the Maoist-inspired Partido Comunista del Perú Sendero Luminoso, known in English as Shining Path, declared its popular war against the Peruvian state in 1980 and proceeded to target so-called counter-revolutionary individuals, institutions, and communities using an unprecedented degree of violence. Massacres carried out by both the Peruvian army and the Shining Path resulted in the death and disappearance of 69,000 people. The members of agricultural cooperatives created by the agrarian reform were threatened both by Shining Path, who saw them as enemies of the people and puppets of imperialism, and by state counterinsurgency forces, who interpreted any involvement in peasant activism or left-wing politics as a possible connection to terrorism. People became too afraid to associate themselves with the cooperatives or their legacy. In the post-conflict era, conservative politicians continue to use the spectre of the internal armed conflict and its association with left-wing politics to maintain the neoliberal and socially conservative status quo. Local experiences of the violence also make people reluctant to talk about the agrarian reform for fear of stirring up resentments and conflicts that often dated back to the agrarian reform era. Historical memory of the agrarian reform has also been shaped by the sudden collapse of the Velasco regime and Peru's steady shift toward a neoliberal economic model. On the 29th of August 1975, the Prime Minister and Minister of War, General Francisco Morales Bermudez, seized control of the government through a palace coup. Although billed as phase 2 of the revolution, in reality, the Morales government soon began to dismantle key aspects of Velasco's reforms. As well as withdrawing financial support from agricultural cooperatives, Morales Bermudez agreed to a series of orthodox stabilization measures that involved a reduction in state spending, devaluation of Peruvian currency, and the introduction of policies that were favorable to foreign investors and the private sector. In 1978, the government began paving the way for the breakup or parcelation of the cooperatives. The trend toward parcelation was further accelerated under President Belaunde from 1980 to 1985. Although the agrarian reform law remained on the statute books until 1991, the rate of expropriation and adjudication declined dramatically after Velasco left office, and government support for the cooperatives dwindled. The neoliberal policies and ideas fostered by the subsequent governments of Alberto Fujimori and Alan Garcia helped consolidate conservative narratives of the agrarian reform as an economic disaster that encouraged dependence on the state. During his second presidency from 2006 to 2011, Garcia oversaw rapid growth in the extractive industries and the reconcentration of agricultural land in the hands of multinational corporations. According to his rhetoric, the land was no longer to belong to those who worked it, but to those who could extract most wealth from it, a complete reversal of the paradigm that underpinned the agrarian reform. Yet even as a relative consensus developed around a dominant narrative of failure and the history of the agrarian reform was marginalized in mainstream politics, different social groups mobilized to enforce their own memory of the agrarian reform and articulate its significance for contemporary politics. This image comes from a newspaper published in 1983, when the image of Velasco was used to mobilize support for strikes against austerity measures. In the 2016 national election, left-wing politician Marisa Glave courted controversy by describing the agrarian reform as an act of social justice, an example of the change that could be achieved through state-led reform. More recently, there's also been a growing tendency among urban young people to take an interest in the political importance of the agrarian reform. A documentary released last year called La Revolución y la Tierra achieved the highest recorded cinema audience of any Peruvian documentary. Collective memory of the agrarian reform is invoked in government discourse and in the press as a symbol to advance or resist certain political projects. But for the rural communities that live through it, the agrarian reform also has a deeply personal significance. This was brought home to me in the comments of Hilario Perez, a former cooperative member in Euro in Cusco. He told me that although the local hacendado left the area soon after his land was expropriated, one of his sons remained. Quote, "He has a small house. He works in tourism and he comes here now. Now we talk, now like civilized people. Now there is no rancor, no hatred. Rather, we treat him well with respect. He always comes. Even with my son, he is not the hacendado's son. He converses." End of quote. Beyond the ideological struggles of national politics, collective memory of the agrarian reform is also shaped by the need for people like Hilario to live alongside those who were once on the opposite side of the political and economic fence. And perhaps in the Q&A, I could go into a bit more detail as to how people do that. So I've outlined here three key arguments in relation to Peru's agrarian reform. First, the state interventions and discourse that surrounded the agrarian reform had a transformative impact on Peruvian political culture. Second, regional diversity mattered hugely when it came to implementing the agrarian reform. Regional politics shaped the overall outcome of the agrarian reform, and the tension between national and regional authorities continues to be a central part of Peruvian politics. Third, collective memory of the agrarian reform is deeply fractured, but the reform remains a key reference point for both national politics and the everyday politics of rural communities. Recent research on land reform in other parts of Latin America has demonstrated its importance in reshaping political culture. Examining the cases of Brazil, Chile, and Venezuela, Nancy Lapp found that redistributive land reform coincided with the expansion of suffrage, as politicians used land reform to build their support base, and the push for reform was in turn strengthened by the growth of mass parties. In the case of Bolivia, Carmen Solis, whose book incidentally comes out the same month as mine, has argued that the nationalist paradigm promoted throughout the country's agrarian reform continued to frame Bolivian political debate even after the MNR revolutionary regime was overthrown by a military coup in 1964. So by including state interventions in local politics, education, and mass communication within the study of the Peruvian agrarian reform, my research adds to growing efforts to uncover the broad political changes stimulated by agrarian reform across Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was a wonderful presentation, offering us good main 3 points that you highlight as the outcome of the book. The transformation of Peruvian political culture as a result of state intervention, regional differentiations, and finally, the role played by collective memory. We have plenty of time for discussion. As usual, we can either take directly questions from the audience if you raise your hands, or you tell us in the chat that device that you want to ask a question, and you are very welcome to unmute yourself and bring in also your face in the Zoom room.
Eduardo, should I stop the recording now?
Perhaps, because we don't know if we can record the audience. So that's